Let's go straight to Davos, where the head of the World Trade Organization has told Arise News that the global trade body stands ready to support African countries in implementing the new regional free trade agreement. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala spoke to Arise business correspondent Rotus Oddiri today at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
The problem with trade from Ukraine is that they couldn't carry out their trade because of the blockade on the Black Sea ports. But where trade is now is that we've actually projected quite a steep decrease in the growth of trade. So last year in 2022, we had a growth rate that we projected of 3.5%. We've reduced that to 1% for 2023. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that forecast. So a lot depends on what happens with the war in Ukraine, as you know, with climate events. A lot also depends on what happens with the way that China is opening up. There could be a further downside, actually a contraction, if things don't go well with monetary tightening by central banks. But if things go well, we could also see an upside. But right now, it's 1%. But let me say this, in spite of that, trade volumes are high when we talk about merchandise trade, and digitally delivered services trade is growing at a phenomenal rate, 14% a year. So trade will be part of the solution for bringing us out of the crisis that we're in, for the recovery, for global recovery.
Director General, I want to ask you about disputes. 3 months into your tenure, China reported Australia to the WTO over tariffs on its exports to Australia. Also, they most recently reported the United States for restrictions of semiconductors exports to China. How are you dealing with disputes this year?
Well, as you know, part of the function of the WTO is that it has a dispute settlement system, perhaps the only one in the world, the only global one that members come to when they disagree with each other or they think that WTO rules have been violated. So, of course, members brought these disputes. But the point that we're saying to them is that it's probably better to try and mediation, dialogue with each other, to try to resolve issues. That is far better, it's faster, and it's more amicable. So that's what we're doing. Yes, it's true that there were issues with China, Australia. There were issues with China and Lithuania and the EU, the US versus the EU and so on. But we're encouraging dialogue first. And I think it's working. We've got the EU talking to the US about the Inflation Reduction Act. South Korea is doing the same. So instead of bringing a dispute to the panel, they are trying dialogue. So let's see how that resolves. Now, one of the points I want to make to you, one of the issues here at Davos that is being talked about is the issue of deglobalization, the fact that the world might fragment into trading blocks. And if that happens, that could have a real impact on trade. And we have done work at the WTO to show that if the world breaks into two trading blocks, decouples into two trading blocks, it will be very, very costly. We will have a 5% decrease in global GDP in the long term. And for emerging markets and developing countries, it could be up to 12%. So we have to be very careful that we do not lose the economies of scale that comes from trading in an integrated world, or the technological spillovers, because if we do by decoupling, it will be very costly. So if we want to grow and for trade to be a part of it, the one thing that we're saying here in Davos is that we must not fragment.
My final question to you, Director General, is on the African Continental Free Trade Area. How do you see trade in Africa this year?
Well, the African Continental Free Trade Area is still taking hold. I think it's one of the most important agreements for us, or arrangements for us to have on the continent. I do not believe we can really achieve Agenda 2063 unless we implement the African Continental Free Trade Area, implement the protocol. So yes, it's important, but of course it's just beginning. I know that 8 countries or 7 countries have started trying to trade under the protocol, but again, that is at the beginning. What we need is for all our countries, now that most of them have ratified the agreement, to actually start putting it into practice, because it will help solve a lot of problems. We have a big market, and if we can have move within such a big market, imagine if we can manufacture things or add value to our agricultural products, for instance, and trade within the area of 1.4 billion people for now. That's huge. So my view is that, look, we trade, intra-African trade is about 15 or 16%. We should be looking to double this within the next decade. Our share of world trade is less than 3%, around 3%. We should look to double that. To do all of this, the African Continental Free Trade Area will be very important. And the WTO is working with countries to assist. We are working through the African Union to support many countries. We spent about 3.5 million Swiss francs supporting countries to building their capacity, to help them with their protocols, to help them in any of the areas they feel they need in order to be able to implement whatever the protocols they've agreed to within the Continental Free Trade Area. We will continue to do that as depending on the demand that we have from African countries. But the WTO stands willing to help because we think it's really, really important.